Today we will be discussing plants, such as their structures, classification, how they reproduce, and many more. An abiotic factor is any non-living factor that affects the plant. In their case, the ecosystem would be the biggest contributor. Let's take a look at a few abiotic factors that affect plants' reproduction and growth. Soil is a factor which plants use to gather nutrients, water, and other valuable resources. Without it, many species would not be able to get adequate nutrients, and water for growth. This would be represented as number 1 in the picture. The amount of wind is a factor that would mainly affect plants that use it as a vector for reproduction when transporting their seeds or spores. Without it, it would have difficulty moving it around. This would be represented as number 2 in the picture. Altitude is also a factor. Very few plants can thrive at high altitudes because less oxygen is made available, making it very hard to grow. This would be number 3 in the picture. Sunlight is one of the most important. Almost all land species of plants require sunlight, and without it, it would not be able to produce nutrients through photosynthesis. Number 4 would be representing this abiotic factor. Lastly, natural disasters like fires, floods, and droughts are unpredictable factors which could destroy many ecosystems if left unchecked. Number 5 would represent this abiotic factor. Before we go into classification and all that, let's look at the differences in sexual and asexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, the offspring arises from a single parent organism and only carry the genes of that organism. So they are basically clones. There is no fusion of gametes, and there's usually quite a number of offspring, and there's very little variation over time compared to sexual reproduction in the population. Sexual reproduction, the offspring arises from 2 parents and can carry the genes of both. There is a fusion between a male sperm cell and a female egg cell into a zygote that will eventually form the new organism. There are very few offspring produced compared to asexual reproduction, but the benefit is that there is a lot of variation between the parent and the offspring. Now for the body of this section. Classification and characteristics of bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Bryophytes are the first type of plants to develop, and these include your mosses and liverworts. These are typically found very close or practically inside water sources, like rivers and areas with lots of shade. The entire surface of the plant absorbs water and does not need a lot of sunlight to grow. Their reproduction requires water, and here's how they reproduce. First, the sporophyte will release spores through asexual reproduction. The spores settle somewhere and grows into a gametophyte. The male antheridia part of it releases sperm, and the female archegona part makes eggs. The sperm uses the water and swims across to fertilize the eggs. Interestingly, mosses are also the first plants to grow in any new areas. Next are pteridophytes. These were the second to develop and include your ferns. They live in moist and shady areas. These guys have vascular tissue, true leaves, and their reproduction also requires water. Under the fern are little clusters of sporangia called sori. These sporangia produce spores and the sori release. It's when the time is right to be picked up and dispersed by the wind. The spores land in water and develops into a gametophyte. The antheridium of the gametophyte produce sperm, which swim using the water to the archegonum, which will house the egg cells to complete fertilization. Thirdly, we have gymnosperms. While being the third to develop, these are seed-bearing spermiophytes, which include your trees like pines and cedars. These have vascular tissue, true roots, stems, and leaves. Their reproduction does not require water, and they live in almost every climate imaginable. These plants have cones, a male and female one. The male one releases pollen grains, and through wind dispersion the grains land on the female one. A pollen tube will develop, and delivering the sperm to the egg for fertilization. The seed is now formed and gets dropped to germinate and grow. So they are wind pollinated. The wood harvested from these gymnosperms is used extensively by humans for building. Lastly, we have the angiosperms. These are the last and most successful plant and the spermophytes to develop. They include all your flowering and fruit-bearing plants. They have vascular tissue, true roots and leaves, and their reproduction does not require water. They also exist in water, on land, and in very dry conditions. Most use animals in their reproduction too. In the flowers, there are structures called stamen. At the end of them are anthers which contain pollen. The angiosperm's petals attract birds and insects, and they act as vectors for the pollen grains.